All right, committee, let's go ahead and get started. I want to start with a reminder. We are getting really busy, especially this week with bill hearings, and Cindy does an excellent job, but she cares a lot, and she cares about the rules of the committee. And when things come in late and disorganized like they have been this week, it's really a pain in her rear end, and then she takes it out on me. Not really. She's very gracious and tries to work with everybody to keep everybody happy. So I would remind all the conferees, please get your materials to us in a timely manner. Have a cover sheet, and also at the top of your testimony, put whether you are a proponent, opponent, or neutral, so she doesn't have to read through the whole testimony to try to figure that out. It makes it a lot easier for her and all of us, really. So just a friendly reminder on that. 24 hours in advance is when testimony is due. We're going to start putting people to written only if they come in late. With that, I'm going to open the hearing on HB 2334, and this is the Apex bill. We'll get an update from the reviser on the suggested changes.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. This bill, as the chairman indicated, makes some amendments to the Apex bill. Those amendments include enhancing some incentives for qualified suppliers and limiting the corporate income tax rate and some other changes that we'll see as we go through the bill. So the first change you'll see is on page 2. And what this does is it changes the sunset that's currently in the bill. If you look on the bottom of page 2, lines 35 through 39, we're limiting the secretary to one agreement with a qualified firm in calendar year 2024, and then one agreement, and then no agreement after with respect to a qualified supplier after May 1st, 2025. And no agreement with a qualified firm after December 31, 2024. So qualified firms, the deadline is December 31, 2024. Qualified suppliers, May 1st, 2025. The next major change, there are a number of changes that, for clarification, that kind of thing that I will not address unless there's a question about it. But the next substantive change is on page 5. And as the committee may recall, the Apex bill provided that a qualified firm or a qualified supplier that was approved for incentives under that program would not be eligible for any other economic development incentives. And the amendment on lines 27 and 28 of page 5 limit that restriction to the project for which the Apex incentives have been approved. So in other words, a qualified firm or a qualified supplier that has been approved for Apex incentives may receive other economic development incentives with respect to a new project or a different project. The next significant change is on page 8 at the bottom of the page. This section makes some changes to the investment tax credit for qualified suppliers. You'll see there that that credit is going to be based on the amount of investment in each taxable year within a 2 calendar year period. and it's enhanced a little bit for the taxable year commencing January 1, 2023. The amount of tax credit shall be up to 10% of the qualified investment, up to a maximum tax credit of $10 million. So the tax credit for qualified suppliers is enhanced. In addition, there is additional discretion granted to the secretary in that the amount of the credit that is earned may be divided into up to 10 equal portions with respect to qualified suppliers, and it is not mandated by the statutory language that it would be 10. So a change there. And then there are other changes in the language to sort of conform with those changes to the qualified supplier investment tax credit. On page 11, in section 3, starting at line 27, we have some additional enhancements with respect to the training and education expense incentive for qualified suppliers under the current Apex provisions. That is limited to $250,000 per year. This bill would increase that with respect to, again, qualified suppliers to $500,000 per year. Some more changes on page 13, and these changes deal with the income tax rate reduction. As you recall, the Apex bill provided that if they're basically upon the secretary entering into an agreement with a qualified firm, there would be income tax rate reductions. And these provisions on page 13 limit those rate reductions to only 2 in total. And so the reduction in the corporate income tax rate is limited to a reduction until 3%, not 0%. So only 2 rate reductions in the corporate income tax rate. And on the bottom of page 13, we have some additional enhancements for the qualified supplier. You recall that in the original Apex bill, a qualified firm was granted an incentive with respect to trying to incentivizing employers to relocate to Kansas. And this change would make that benefit also available to qualified suppliers. That's on the bottom of page 13, section 5. So qualified suppliers would be eligible for the relocation incentive. And the amount of that would be up to $250,000 to a qualified supplier. And that is, I think, the high points of what the bill does. There's also a conforming change to the fund, adding qualified suppliers to the fund for those purposes. But I think that's the high points of the bill. So would stand for questions.
Thanks, Charles. Representative Patton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charles, on page 9, and maybe you touched on this when you were talking about qualified suppliers, but if I look at like lines 6 through 20, am I right that that's significantly increasing the amount of credit that could be eligible? Because that up to 10% seems substantially more than the 5% on the first 50 million and 1% on each additional 10 up to 100 million.
Yeah, I think that would be a significant.
Okay, thank you.
What did it used to be, Charles?
I'm sorry.
What can you tell us what the change? What it changed?
Well,
from?
Under current law, if you look there on page 9, lines 6 through 10, the amount of the tax credit is 5% for the first 50 million, and an additional 1% for each additional 10 million up to maximum of 100 billion in qualified investment. Now that, and then what we're doing is we're adding, commencing in January 1, 2023, the amount of the credit is up to 10%, up to a maximum tax credit of 10 million. So I think that first part, so this, I think this part is in reference to the qualified supplier. And so it would be an increase in the benefit to the qualified supplier.
Representative Patton, did you have a follow-up?
Well, I went to law school because I wasn't any good with math, so don't trust my numbers. But I think under current law, if you do a $100 million investment, you could get 3.5 million in tax credits, and under the changes, you could get 10 million. So quite a bit more. But again, I'm not very good at math.
All right, so we'll table that question for the Department of Commerce when they come up to see what the intent was.
Well, I would agree that it's increased, but yeah, they would be helpful in addressing that specifically.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing no more questions, Charles, thanks a lot. Let's move on to the proponent section. We have one proponent. That's Paul Hughes, Deputy Secretary of Commerce. Welcome back to Commerce, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, the Kansas Department of Commerce is requesting that the Kansas Legislature support changes to the economic development tool APEX, attracting powerful economic expansion, to permit the state to continue to compete for an additional mega project with other supplier companies. Through bipartisan collaboration, not only was the APEX tool created, 2 APEX agreements have been signed, Panasonic and Integra. These historic economic development projects will diversify the state's economy, invest billions of dollars in Kansas, and provide thousands of high-quality jobs for Kansans. As announced on July 13th, the Department of Commerce, with unanimous approval from the State Finance Council, reached an agreement with Panasonic Energy. Panasonic's plans to build one of the largest electric battery facilities of its kind in the U.S. at a site in DeSoto. The facility represents a $4 billion approximate capital investment, creating 4,000 new jobs in the state and 4,000 additional jobs created by suppliers and community businesses, and up to 16,500 construction jobs. With unanimous approval from the State Finance Council, the Department of Commerce reached an agreement with Integra in February. This agreement paves the way for the company's transformative semiconductor project and provides the opportunity for Integra to apply to the U.S. Department of Commerce for CHIPS and Science Act funding. Integra's expansion plans are designed to address recent risks identified in the U.S. semiconductor supply chain, support the domestic semiconductor ecosystem, and strengthen advanced manufacturing in Kansas. The facility represents $1.8 billion in planned capital investment, 1,994 new jobs, and 3,161 additional jobs created by suppliers and community businesses, with the construction with the construction of a new 1 million square foot facility in Wichita. The expansion of the sunset to December 31st, 2024, and the ability for the state to compete for one additional APEX agreement with a qualified firm is the first change proposed by this bill. The business community has been watching Kansas as our 2 APEX agreements have been negotiated and fully executed. Following the passage of APEX, 9 megaprojects approached us with the interest of investing in Kansas. Since then, The pace of manufacturing mega project interest has slowed due to the approaching Apex sunset in December. The details of the 2023 sunset were well publicized since the inception of the tool, and the site selector community took notice. Now, with the Integra announcement, the mega project site selector community is pausing on Kansas until a compatible incentive program is available. Our recent successes demonstrate the powerful nature of the Apex tool. There remains time to capture one more mega project deal if the sunset is extended and one additional agreement is allowed. I'd like to remind Mr. Chair and members of the council that those agreements also undergo the State Finance Council's rigor. With these changes, the Department of Commerce can return to working diligently to land another mega project. It is important to note the third Apex agreement would not trigger a reduction of 0.5% to the corporate income tax. This is the second change proposed identified in the bill. Additionally, this bill allows a qualified firm who has signed an Apex agreement to be eligible for traditional incentives for a new and different project. Currently, this is not permitted under Apex. However, with our standard incentive tools, companies can negotiate multiple agreements and receive multiple benefits for each new project. Most new jobs are created by existing companies. Once we get the companies to Kansas, we need to maximize their value by making Kansas their choice for all new expansions. Handcuffing a company to prevent them from accessing tools to grow their presence in the state is the opposite of the goal of Apex. If we use Apex incentives to bring a company to Kansas, we should be able to use the traditional incentives to keep them here. Lastly, to fully maximize the momentum and utilization of Apex, 3 changes are needed regarding the supplier benefits. The first is removing the sliding scale, which is the question we had moments ago, and to change the language to read up to 10 years to provide flexibility regarding the timeline to this refundability. The confusion around this aspect of the bill isn't new. It's the reason we're asking for the change. Originally, when we were working that in the original bill, the intent was to allow that each $10 million increment to continue to add up to what the total project investment was. So that's why it reads an additional 1% for each 10 million. But the sum total, the limit or the cap to that benefit to the suppliers is the same. If it were a $100 million CapEx under the old project, they would qualify for 10%. And under this new language, it just reads more clearly that they're available up to 10% for the total amount capped at $100 million or $10 million. Additionally, there's an increase in training reimbursement up to $500,000 per year for 5 years, a change from the original $250,000. And we are adding a relocation reimbursement incentive that does not exceed $250,000 per supplier per year. The update to the language regarding the refundable investment tax credit for suppliers would provide Commerce the ability to better negotiate with supplier companies. The additional training support will enhance companies' efforts to skill up workforce related to EV batteries and semiconductors, as well as other future industries where the workforce does not currently have the necessary skills. Similarly, the relocation reimbursement benefit, which is offered to the mega project, would address the workforce shortage issues and grow our state where the suppliers bring people to work. These updates to the supplier benefits create a more robust recruitment package. These changes to the Apex bill will send a strong message to the business community that Kansas remains open for business. It further leverages the momentum we have built to seize the opportunity to provide good-paying jobs that help keep our talented young people in the state and generate billions in new revenue. I urge the committee to favorably pass HB 2334 that makes the much-needed changes to the Apex law. With that, we have to answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
No biggie. Questions? Representative Dodson.
Well, thank you for coming today. On page 2, line 35, is this what you were talking about in the beginning? Are we just doing this 1 year at a time? Or is that the way you see this playing out? There were these extensions to 2024, 2025.
This extension was for a single year, and we felt that was necessary to basically sustain the pipeline that we currently have. And we felt that that was a reasonable starting position to ask for one additional year.
So this is kind of a combination between some flexibility given maybe our budgetary risk of bringing in more.
From a budgetary risk standpoint, there is a financial rigor and analysis that occurs before the agreement goes to State Finance Council for approval. In no situation would we want to engage in a practice or an agreement that harms the state of Kansas. So this would allow us to develop the deal to be considered. And at a later date, the State Finance Council can decide whether or not that deal is in the state's interest.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions? Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as Representative Patton had said earlier, we were talking about some of the increased cost. Were you able to comment on that? I don't see a fiscal note attached to this as well. So do we know the approximate cost that these modifications will have?
What we do know is what the two agreements we've currently signed into, what the fiscal notes are for those respectively. What we don't know is on this third project, we don't have that project ginned up, so to speak. The challenge here is we're not allowed to enter into that agreement in the same year that we've already entered into one. So the project that we're talking about, we wouldn't be able to enter into that agreement until 2024. And these deals move at their own pace. If ready or not, here they come and go. So what we're looking for here is the ability to, in good faith, approach mega projects for a deal in 2024. I don't have a specific deal that we would be offering up for the 2024 slot.
Thank you. So I wasn't in Commerce last term, and I wasn't privy to all of the discussion that actually got to the Apex bill. I did ultimately support the Apex bill as it was drafted last year on the floor. But you're looking to make not only, changes in terms of sunsetting and changing in terms of timeline, but also increased, benefits to suppliers and other groups. And so I'm trying to understand better the need for that, given that under the previous Apex bill or the current Apex bill, or what is law, we were able to secure the largest investment in the history of Kansas. So what modifications need to be made because of that?
Mr. Chair, Representative Clayton, outstanding question. Excuse me. Sorry.
We mixed up the signs there.
Going by the name tags, you're throwing me off. It's an outstanding question. So on that, when we were originally negotiating the Apex bill, the supplier portion doesn't reflect what was proposed in the original bill. And the changes that occurred there, we were willing to test with the existing arrangements under Panasonic. So we had a certain gut sense, if you will, how the supplier benefits would work out with Panasonic. Now we've had a chance to test that with their supplier base. And what we're finding is that they are slow to come to Kansas because they're evaluating is the incentive support there, is the state support there to establish either a new facility for them or to grow a facility that they already have here. So what we're seeing is a slower than desired absorption of the supplier benefits by the mega project suppliers.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I'm reading this right, the agreement that you just made with Integra or whatever is that right, Integra? If we change this, I'm trying to think where it's at, but if we change it, you could actually, okay, it's on page 9 in the, starting on number 11, where you change that taxable year tax credit to the 10% or 10 million. That would be usable with the new Integra deal, right?
From a mathematical standpoint, the numbers work out to be the same. So we're just clarifying the language because it generates a lot of questions from the site selector community. Why did you prescribe this 5% for the first 50 million and then incrementally adding 1% in $10 million investment windows when it would just read more clearly to say 10% up to a maximum of $100 million of investment? It's a cleanup. The mathematically it works out to the same.
I don't think it is, sir.
No, it's not.
You
It's
could give 10. You could give 10% on any number, where the current language doesn't allow that.
Yeah, it doesn't have the 100,000 or 100 million in there anymore. So, but I was wondering, would that language though be able to be used on on the Integra deal?
The changes that we're proposing, Representative Hoffman, Mr. Chair, the changes that we're proposing are for the 2024 slot.
But that's not what this says. This says commencing January 1st, 2023. And we can debate. I mean, you can talk about that later. But the former representative asked partly what I was going to ask. I think adding another sunset is one thing, but I think that you have gone in here, changed a lot of things that were decided on that many of us didn't want to actually vote for it in the first place. We did finally because some of the changes, and now you're coming back, and I mean, even the reducing the benefit for existing businesses in the state. I mean, you're going to stop that after another being able to do one more move. So I wish you would have just come in with an extension of the with the sunset. Maybe if you need to clean up a little bit of the language, but I think you're trying to add a lot more of what we're going to be giving on the next one, and I think your explanation of that these suppliers are coming in slow. The major project hasn't even been built yet, and you can't expect major or other suppliers to necessarily start building their facilities until they see how long it's going to be before the major facility is built. So I think that's not really a very good, in my opinion, a very good explanation of why you want to change that. But I think that one spot is definitely not the same. So I would suggest that we look at that a lot more. I know there's not really a big question in there, but a little bit more of my opinion.
Representative Patton.
I think you want to explain, so I'm going to ask a question and then say whatever you want. So back to that section I keep talking about. So I now agree, and that language is confusing, so it does need to be cleaned up. But $100 million investment, the tax credit would be the same under old language and new language. I agree with that now. I think the difference would be a $50 million investment right now could only be 5% of a tax credit, and the new language would potentially give you 10% of a $50 million investment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Which would be a $5 million
right? And
credit.
And you want that? Just making sure that's what the language says, and so that's the discretion Commerce is asking for.
That's correct.
Okay. And then was there anything else you wanted to say to the last question?
Mr. Chair, if I may, it's in regards to the comment on the suppliers. So one really peculiar aspect of these mega projects as it relates to the suppliers is that these discussions take place in privacy within the mega project itself. And an area that is of risk to them is on the supplier side when they share with the suppliers that what their plans are. And the reason that's a risk is because the suppliers oftentimes need to be set up and running ahead of the main operations of the mega project. So generally speaking, when we're working with the supplier base, there's an early signal that they now have to scramble to get ahead of the mega project and be operational ahead of the main project. And we're not seeing that. And so that's the reason, part of the supporting rationale behind that ask.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just for context for these changes, can you remind us the total number of jobs expected to be created through the suppliers and through the main corporations so far with the two that we have plus their suppliers?
Representative Williams, Mr. Chair, for the Panasonic project, the suppliers were almost on par with the mega project itself at 4,000 under the suppliers, generated by the suppliers, and 4,000 by the mega project itself. And in the instance of Integra, it was 3,161 supplier jobs as compared to 1,994 by the mega project itself. So the supplier base was actually larger than the mega project.
Okay, so did you say 8,000 with suppliers for the Panasonic, and the suppliers plus Panasonic is about 8,000?
The two combined would, I'm speaking just to the suppliers, the two combined would be 7,161.
Okay, so what I'm looking for, and you could help me do it a lot quicker, is how many total jobs are we talking about between Integra and Panasonic and their suppliers?
For Panasonic, it's 8,000 total jobs between suppliers and the mega project. And for Integra, it's 5,155 between the mega project and the suppliers.
And for what you're looking to do, so we're going to we're extend the sunset, and we're having all of these provisions, and we want to do away with the reduction in the corporate income tax rate. Do you have an anticipated number for the next phase?
For the 2024
Yes.
project, I do not.
Okay, I didn't know if that was specific. So my concern is that we're already talking about 13,000 jobs at least. And in Kansas, we have a net migration loss. And I just have and then at the same time, we're asking to reduce, Commerce doesn't want to reduce corporate income tax for those that are already here working and making an income. And I feel like those businesses are going to be hard pressed to compete with wages and jobs with these businesses, because these major corporations and suppliers are incentivized to such a high degree that if you have a small business, you are potentially going to lose your employees to this business. So I don't know. I think this is a concern for Kansas.
As a point of clarification, do you already have suppliers that you've made deals with for Panasonic and for Integra, both?
We have, Mr. Chair, we have supplier agreements in place with Panasonic. Those supplier agreements also go through the State Finance Council process for review and fiscal scrutiny. And we have not identified any of the suppliers for Integra under the Apex bill.
Okay. How many more of these do you suppose we could afford as a state?
Mr. Chair, that's a very interesting question. We review every one of these to make sure that exactly that the state can afford to do that. We don't know what the next mega project is. We have a pipeline, but what's most concerning is that that pipeline has stopped accumulating because of the view that this program's going to end. And I can provide more clarity on that if I can negotiate in good faith a deal that the State Finance Council could then evaluate and approve if the state can afford to do that. But that conversation occurs, bless you, between Commerce and the Office of Budget before every State Finance Council meeting. That exact question: can the state afford to do this?
All right, so Panasonic, just Panasonic. All in, we were $825 million in incentives, somewhere around there.
My recollection is 829 million, correct?
Okay. What about infrastructure? There's a lot of construction going on down there. There's a lot of roads being built, bridges. What's the state of Kansas spending for infrastructure for this plant?
What made that site interesting to Panasonic was that those infrastructure improvements were already planned and budgeted. What needed to be done was to accelerate the calendar on when those projects were going to be built. So the improvements to K10, water improvements planned by the city, funded under bonding projects, were all already in the works. That's what made the site workable. If those had not already been occurring, then the chances are excellent we would not have won the Panasonic project.
What was the cost on it?
I don't have that complete picture for local incentives.
They did not communicate with you on the local incentives for Panasonic?
They did communicate. I just don't have that recall at the top of my head, Mr. Chair.
All right. And it's my understanding we just gave them a building that's worth about $7 million.
Mr. Chair, the agreement on the KBA building was something that was identified with the Finance Council last year as a component to the project. The building in question has a significant amount of deferred maintenance on it. Was coming, even at its fully leased rate, was burning cash at Commerce. And it's a building that came into our custody to make sure that it was put to its best use, and we felt that was its best use.
You are aware, though, that we had a bioscience company that wanted to purchase that for appraised value.
If the appraised value was $3 million, then I would agree, yes. The reality is that building cost $14 million to build, and all offers after we solicited the building last year were well below what the appraisal value of the building was.
I have some questions on how these other incentives are going to work. And I was talking to Rachel about this earlier on Panasonic, for example. They want to build a second building, or if they did want to build a second building and they wanted to take advantage of our other incentive programs, how are you going to separate the employees where they're all parking in the same parking lot? Some of the employees walk into one building and they get a 10% rebate on their payroll, but the other ones just get whatever they collect, 90% of whatever they collect, because they're on a peak program. If you were the company, wouldn't you want to put as many people in the payroll of the 10% rebate? How are you going to separate that and track that?
Mr. Chair, each year to receive those benefits under either program, under Apex or our standard state incentives, part of that filing process through the Department of Revenue includes a line item list of each employee. And through that process, they would have to identify which business unit that employee is tied to. So we would have a line item for each employee on what aspect of the business they're tied to.
On the second program, the Integra, what's the all-in cost for just Integra?
For just Integra, I believe that figures, Mr. Chair, I believe that figures $304 million state cost.
And this is before any incentives are given to any of the suppliers with the other 7,000 some jobs.
That's correct.
So Kansas has a $3 billion surplus roughly right now. And with these first two projects, we've blown through $1 billion before we even get through to the suppliers. That's why my question was, how many of these can we afford? If the suppliers come in and it's another 400, 500, 600 million, there's not a whole lot left for the Kansas taxpayers to get any kind of a tax cut.
Well, Mr. Chair, these incentives are paid out. Also, one important consideration is the number of years in which they're paid. So these total amounts are paid over a 10-year period of time after the project is completed, 3 to 5 years into the future. So there is a great deal of amortizing the cost of these projects over a multitude of years, allowing the state the latitude to manage its finances accordingly.
So it's not surprising to me, and probably not to this committee at all, that they're having trouble finding employees here and that they need to import people to work there, which is why you're asking for an increase in relocation. It says add relocation reimbursement incentive not to exceed $250,000 per supplier per year. And how many suppliers can we have on each project?
Mr. Chair, the mega project or the qualifying project can identify up to 5.
So that is $1.25 million a year for 5 years.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
The relocation reimbursement doesn't cap it at 5 years. Is it capped in the bill for 5 years? I'm looking at your testimony, 3rd page.
Can we ask the reviser to read that, please, Mr. Chair?
Charles. While I was looking at his testimony, we're talking about the relocation reimbursement to the suppliers. Is there a time certain? $250,000 per supplier per year. How long can they collect that? For 10 years.
So line 4, page 14.
All right, sir. So it's not surprising that they need to do that, but we're also putting a tremendous amount of pressure on an already stressed workforce environment for the rest of our companies. And so would you be opposed to inserting a tax credit for all of our current businesses if they wanted to move somebody in from out of state to work at their location? Could they participate with something like this with a tax credit? Would you be opposed to that to help workforce development in the state of Kansas?
I would say that we're open to that discussion.
On the training dollars, $500,000 per year for 5 years, who does that get paid to? I mean, if they were doing their own training, do we pay them to pay the salaries of their own people, or these dollars that are going to go into our community colleges for training?
Mr. Chair, it's actually a mix of those. Panasonic is already engaged in what they're calling a workforce consortium that includes Johnson County Community College and a number of other community colleges in the area. But it's a mix that goes in. Some of it's going to be classroom studies for their own staff, production workers and whatnot. Some will be with community colleges as partners in the training process.
Are there any other questions? I saved mine for the end. So, Representative Clayton.
Sorry, some of the other questions brought up a question of mine. Just to talk a little bit more about workforce development, and the chair and I were fortunate enough to serve on an interim committee on workforce development. One of the things that I might posit to this committee is that instead of tax incentives, there is one thing that we can do to increase workforce development and to increase our population that will not cost us a thing. And that is to maybe tone down some of the rhetoric here in the State House. I've seen some really nasty legislation that's come through that has told people that they are blatantly not welcome here based on their race, their sexual orientation, or even if their companies want to institute those types of things. So I sincerely hope that we don't spend all of this money giving away a lot of these extra incentives to businesses that need to relocate when all we need to do is just adjust our attitudes. I do hope that the Department of Commerce does support DEI training. I think that's something that we've seen a lot of the people in our workforce roundtables support. So we won't, hopefully, would you oppose any sort of provision that would be added onto this bill that would prohibit any companies taking advantage of those incentives from using that?
Representative Clayton, thank you for your comments. Just as a reminder to the members of the committee, Commerce also oversees the Office of Women and Minority-Owned Businesses. It's a core part of what we do every day to make sure that this rising tide does lift all boats. I agree that hostile rhetoric doesn't help from a workforce attraction standpoint, and it does not help from a business attraction standpoint. We're open to these sorts of discussions, but here today, the intent is to build programs around creating the jobs, creating the workforce for the jobs that of tomorrow. So future-proofing the economy by upskilling the workforce that we have and making sure that they're available for in some of these industries like the semiconductor space. This is a national security issue, and it's a national problem. We lost that workforce in this country. The creator of the integrated circuit, Jack Kilby, is from Great Bend, Kansas. That knowledge is now in Asia, and we have to bring it back. And so the whole thrust of the CHIPS Act work that we're doing, our entire workforce development activities, women and minority enterprises are all about making sure that we have full mix and full involvement of the entire population, not just segments of it.
All right, I'm not seeing any further questions. There was just one that you couldn't answer, and that was what the local incentives were. If you could get that to the committee when you get a chance to get your hands on it, that'd be great.
Be my pleasure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks for coming in and testifying.
Thank you.
I'm not showing any other proponents that are in person. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to the bill as a proponent? Seeing none, we'll move to the opponent section. First up was Representative Auerkamp, but it doesn't look like he's here. He's got his own committee meeting right now, and if he can get over here, he will. So we'll skip over him for now and go to Dave Travert, Kansas Policy Institute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Dave Travert with Kansas Policy Institute. We're pleased to be here to, as we did last year, oppose this bill. I'll start by posing a hypothetical. If giving away taxpayer money worked, why are we in our fifth straight decade of economic stagnation? The alphabet soup of programs has changed over the decades. There's HPIP and there's PEAK and there's STAR and there's studies and there's audits that come out and say they don't work as promised or hoped. The gap between Kansas and the national average on job creation, on wage distribution, on economic growth through GDP is getting worse. And yet here we keep going, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Even if we get the promised number of jobs from those two projects, that would increase the job base in Kansas by maybe less than 1%. That is not the kind of change that changes the trajectory of an economy. It's nice, but that's not what it won't have that effect, especially since some of those jobs will come from existing employers. We know that. That's what employers fear. we're shifting the cost of these programs and government in general onto taxpayers. The local taxpayer, yes, local government, I don't have the number, but I've heard from a lot of people, business owners and individuals, while cities and counties are handing out millions in subsidies, they're also imposing 10% property tax increases. So some people get a nice windfall, others get a much bigger tax bill, and a lot of those people are literally being taxed out of their homes. The subsidy, according to the Tax Foundation, the subsidies, all told, that Kansas has, is the part of the reason that Kansas has the highest effective tax rate on mature businesses in the country. We don't have a big enough checkbook that we can attract companies to move here when we're chasing so many away, when we're discouraging so many businesses from even getting started. I think that it is incumbent upon the legislature to ask a lot more questions. I've heard some really good ones here today. But the one I'd like to hear even Commerce answer is, if these things work, if this type of a scheme works, why are we in our 5th consecutive decade of economic stagnation? And with that, I'll be happy to stand for questions.
Any questions? Not seeing any.
Oh, I was looking forward to it.
Are there any other opponents present? I'm not seeing any. Move on to neutral. Alex Oral. Bankers Association.
Good afternoon, committee. Alex Oral, Alex Oral with Kansas Bankers Association, Senior Vice President of Government Relations. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I have never been so excited to give neutral testimony on a bill. I'm finally talking about something else other than ESG. So thank you, committee, for having a bill that I can discuss in different details. We are giving neutral testimony on HB 2334, and I'm going to specifically talk about Section 4B of the legislation. Last year when Apex was passed, as many of you remember, it was kind of a rushed effort. There was very quick, and there's some amendments made at the end. There was one thing that was left out of that bill last year. You did include a corporate reduction. Appreciate the work of that to help our business community, but the privilege tax was left out of that piece of legislation. For those of you on the committee that don't know, Kansas banks, trust companies, savings, and loans do not pay Kansas corporate income tax. We pay what's called the Kansas privilege tax. I wish it was called the financial institutions tax. It'd be a lot more easily understandable. And the reason we have a separate tax rate is because the privilege tax taxes interest income from U.S. agency treasury and securities, where the corporate income tax does not. So the difference in the tax rate between the two entities reflects that difference in taxation. So Kansas banks pay a combined rate. It's actually a two-tier rate of 4.375%, and banks and savings and loans pay 4.5%. The primary tax of that is 2.25% on the first $25,000 of income, and the second part is what's called the surtax, which gets it to that 4.375 and 4.5%. So just a little background, just tax policy in general for Kansas banks. We would respectfully request, either the chairman or the committee, when you look at this bill or allow me to work with Charles on an amendment, I would consider a friendly amendment because I think the intent of the corporate reduction was to give relief to businesses. Banks, trust companies, savings and loans are businesses too. We're just subject to a different tax. So I would respectfully request an amendment to include language that provides for a corresponding rate reduction for privileged taxpayers as well. You might be asking what that rate would be. You lower you lower corporate income from 7% to 6.5%. That is a 7.14% reduction. You apply that same exact 7.14% reduction to the privilege tax rate. You lower it from 6.5 to 6. That's an 8% reduction. You apply that exact same reduction to the privilege tax. It's going to be a weird number, just being upfront, because you're applying a percentage decrease. So The first tier for banks would be a reduction of 0.315%. And for trust companies and savings and loans, it'd be 0.32 instead of the 0.5%. Because you can't just do a 0.5%, because then we would actually get more relief than our corporate partners. And we're not asking for that. We're not asking for anything more, anything less. We want the exact same. That second piece would be a 0.33 reduction for banks and a 0.34 for trusts or savings loans and our trust companies. So would respectfully request, when you look at this bill, I know there's probably going to be some tweaks to it, but would respect to be included in that bill. And then when you're just talking about tax policy in general, do remember that banks are businesses too. We're just subject to a different tax. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Yeah, yes, sir. So I can recall these conversations, and the intent was to include the banks. That just didn't, as we rushed it through. There was supposed to be a cleanup bill that came last year on it, but we didn't get to it. So I think that when we put the tax reduction back in, that we would include the banks in that as well.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Last year, so you all are aware, the Apex bill didn't land until after you left. So we didn't know we got the project then. So the urgency to pass a trailer bill while you're in session on this was kind of put to the back burner because we didn't even know if we're going to get the project in general.
Representative Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the interest of parity with corporate tax incomes, I know there are some proposals out there that call for a 5% flat tax on corporate incomes. Would you guys support raising your privilege tax up to 5% in the interest of parity that you're asking for here?
No, we would not. Because we are taxed more on the interest income from agency, treasury and securities, treasury bills, treasury notes. So no, there is the tax bill. I'll be testifying on that on Wednesday. That does have a corresponding rate reduction. If you lower from 7 to 5%, that's a 28.57% reduction. We just apply that exact same percentage decrease to those two rates in that bill as well. And I'm talking about the surtax, not the primary. The surtax reduction. So I think it's like 0.88% or something in the bill. So like I said, it's a weird number, but wanted to make sure to at least highlight why and the reason how we got there.
Any further questions? All right, we're not seeing any. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
Any other neutral testimony in the room? Not seeing any. Committee, there's 4 different writtens, and we're going to move Representative Arrowcamp to written so you can review. It's all on the S drive for you to look at. We're going to go ahead and close the hearing on 2334. Looks like we still have some time, so we're going to now move to 2344 from 2334. I'm going to open a hearing on 2344, and we'll get a brief overview of what the bill does.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. This bill is also brought to you by the Department of Commerce and makes some changes to the Council on Travel and Tourism, and also a Department of Commerce matching grant program to promote tourism. So if you look at the first page of the bill, there's a lot of strikeout and a lot of additions. Those are mostly cosmetic. Some of it involves changing, getting rid of references to tourism, the Committee on Tourism and Parks, because due to the changes, that's now the Department of Commerce. There is one substantive change, and that's on line 15. We're changing the council from 17 to 20 members. And if you turn the page, you can see that those you can see again, there's a lot of text amendments, but most of those again are structural. The changes are in lines 25 through 28, where we are adding 3 additional organizations to the council. And these are organizations that are appointed, the representatives are appointed by the governor from a list of 3 individuals each organization presents. And these additional organizations are the National Independent Venue Association, and there's a requirement that the nominees that the governor can select from are to be Kansas residents, the Kansas Museums Association, and the Kansas Sampler Foundation. So 3 additional members to the Council on Tourism. The other thing the bill does is if you turn the page to page 3 with respect to the state matching grant program to promote tourism, under current law, 50% of the monies under that program are to be allocated to, or rather 75% of the monies under that program are to be allocated to public entities or nonprofit organizations. This bill would change that 75% to 50%. In addition, under current law, either a public entity or nonprofit organization or a private organization is limited to no more than 20% of the monies granted, and this bill would remove that restriction. So the secretary could award more than 20% to any one either nonprofit entity, public entity, or a private entity. And that is what the bill does.
Any questions for the revisor? Seeing none. Thank you. Proponent, we'll start with Rachel Willis, Department of Commerce.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of the committee, Rachel Willis, Director of Legislative Affairs for the Department of Commerce. I hope this one is a little bit easier than the last one. So anyway, we're here to obviously testify in support of HB 2344. It removes the references to wildlife and parks. It expands the membership of the Governor's Council on Travel and Tourism and modifies the Attraction Development Grant Program. So on July 1st of 2021, Kansas Tourism became its own independent division within Commerce. This reorganization was the result of input from businesses and destination marketing organizations and other key industry partners, which all agreed that it was best to consolidate Kansas's tourism efforts and economic development initiatives. So as a result, there are just a few minor changes to the statute that governs Kansas tourism that need to be made. So this bill will remove those references to wildlife parks and tourism and change it to commerce. It additionally updates the references to specific legislative committees to reflect the current committee names of the legislature, which Charles referred to. The bill then does include 2 other changes. We would like to add 3 additional members to the Governor's Council on Travel and Tourism, bringing that total membership number up to 20. The new representatives would include a Kansas resident of the National Independent Venue Association, a representative from the Kansas Museum Association, and the Kansas Sampler Foundation. These new members represent different stakeholders who have an interest in travel and tourism, that industry in the state. And we think that they'll bring great value as that council really guides Kansas tourism. And as we all continue to work to bring more visitors to our state. Lastly, the bill aligns the grant allocation percentages for the Attraction Development Grant Program with the needs of our state and what we're seeing as far as applications for that particular grant. So this program is a small funding opportunity that is provided annually. It's designed to assist in the development of sustainable market-driven travel experiences within the state, increase visitation to Kansas, and generate economic impact resulting from the creation of jobs and capital investment and tax revenue. So last year for this particular grant, there were 22 nonprofits. So 56% of the applications received came from nonprofits, 17 came from for-profit organizations, which is roughly 44%. And we provided a total of $251,544 in grant funding for 11 new projects or enhancements to specific attraction development projects across the state. So we would like to see this change, the percentage change, again, go from 75% to 50. So it's just an even divide between the private and the public eligible organizations. Again, we just feel like this aligns better with the type of organizations that are applying, and will allow tourism to continue to award funding to those most feasible projects described in the application process. So I will stand for questions.
Any questions, committee? Not seeing anything. I've got one. The changing the committee size from 17 to 20, what was the logic behind that? Were the 17 people not able to make decisions, or why 20?
Sure. No, we just felt like the three organizations that we've identified as far as adding to the council really represent Kansas tourism. And we felt like they need a voice at that table to help guide our decisions and efforts related to bringing more visitors to Kansas.
What if there's a tie in the vote? There's an even number of people, where before there was an odd number for probably a purpose.
It's a good question.
Any other questions? Right, the chairman, the House Chairman of Commerce breaks a tie.
Sure.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions for you. Natalie Bright, are you in person today? All right.
Am I on? Yes. Good afternoon. Happy Valentine's Day to all of you. Hope you get to spend some time with somebody you love tonight. I am here on behalf of the tourism industry to say that we support this bill. I think that's a great question that it adds it to 20, and so we will ask about that. Your minority leader here might be able to help talk a little bit about the committee, because he serves on the Travel and Tourism Committee. He's one of your representatives from the legislature. But I can tell you that the three areas that they want to add are important parts of our tourism community. And so we do support adding that small venue, the Kansas Sampler, and the museums, who all actually have a voice within our industry and have different positions within our board. The small grant attraction changes they want to make, we also support. Bridget Job, who's the tourism director, actually came from industry, and we really enjoy having her there because she's got a true vantage point and really her pulse on what changes need to happen. And so we really trust her guidance in this proposal and feel she had a lot to do with moving that so that it can be the most effective use of these dollars to make sure that you're getting the return on the investment when they utilize those. And with that, I would stand for questions.
Any questions? Are these paid positions? Maybe they should be.
Are you
right?
offering up to be the 21st?
No. All right. Seeing no questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not seeing anyone else that is here to testify on this bill. And so we'll close the hearing on this bill. Charles, would you be prepared to talk about 2275? Yes. Okay. This is the other disability bill that we didn't get to yesterday because there was a possible amendment in the works, and I think they have some sort of an agreement on that, but we'll talk about that after we get a review of what the bill does. So we're on discussion of House Bill 2275. Charles Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. So the committee will recall that House Bill 2275 makes some changes to the tax credit for taxpayers who purchase items from qualified vendors that employ disabled individuals. And there are some, those changes include increases in the amount of cumulative credits over 5-year periods, and an addition of, as far as the type of organization that can benefit from these credits, a division within a Kansas not-for-profit organization. The bill also permits part-time employment for disabled individuals. And I think those are the primary things the bill does.
Any questions on what the bill does for the reviser? Not seeing any. Is there a sunset in this time?
Thank you, Chairman. I've neglected to mention that the bill also removes the sunset.
Okay, great. Seeing no further questions for you, we'll move on to further discussion. Is there any discussion or amendments on the bill? Representative Laura Williams.
I have an amendment. Charles, do you have that? Charles
go
also,
ahead and explain your amendment while he hands it out.
As Charles hands it out, he added some cleanup language on it, but what this amendment does, it just closes the loophole of allowing 14C entities that pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage from participating in these tax credits. And this amendment has been agreed on both the proponent side and the opponent side.
Representative Clayton, did you have a question on the amendment? Is there any discussion on the amendment? Not seeing any, but I do want to say something about these work shelters that we're talking about here. I almost didn't want to hear this bill, but it's important. This bill is important for the disability community, so I went ahead with it. In the past, I have warned conferees about dragging these work shelter programs through the mud, but they came up here and did it anyway. These shelters do perform a good function for these disability individuals. They are people that really can't do anything. And if you do away with programs like that, they will rot at home. There's no place for them to go. They're taken care of. They're fed. They have a place to go and be functionable, and they're happy. But when we come up here and we start dragging them through the mud, I don't support this amendment because I think we need to support those companies. But I'll let you guys vote on it however you want. There is an agreement on both sides. I do not agree with it. With that, I'll go ahead and is there any other discussion on that? Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to try to understand, as I've heard both the proponents and the opponents agree on this, but I thought that there was a discussion about all of the references to within such division. There's 3 of them in the bill, but only one of them is being amended. So I'm just trying to understand if the other 2 were not of concern to the opponents of this bill.
Charles, you can answer that, but I believe that they only struck it for that one line so that they could, for the 14C or what the work shelters. The others would allow companies like Goodwill to have a separate division to take advantage of this program and Goodwill, but they could not do it if they are paying sub-minimum wage anywhere in the company. Is that right, Charles?
Yes, Chairman.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Okay, seeing none. You may close.
I move for the passage of the amendment on House Bill 2275.
Seconded by Representative Clayton. You've heard the amendment and the motion. All in favor say aye. All against say no.
No.
Noes appear to have it. Division's been called. All in favor, raise your right hand. All right. All against, raise your right hand. Chair votes no. Motion fails. Any further discussion on the bill? Not seeing any. Can we get a motion to pass the bill favorably? Representative Bourgeon.
Mr. Chair, I move the committee recommend House Bill 2275 favorably for passage.
Seconded by Representative Dodson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All against, say no.
No.
Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Bill passes. Anyone want their no vote recorded for this disability bill? Poskin, Osmond, Clayton, Laura Williams, Shu, and Probst. Did I leave anybody out? All right. There's nothing else on the agenda. We have two bills tomorrow. We'll see you at 1:30. Thanks.